Come tomorrow, that is Saturday, March 8th, the world celebrates International Women's Day. And in light of this occasion, on Press Perspective today, we touch upon issues related to gender equality here in South Korea. Do stay with us. Hello, you're watching Press Perspective. It is Friday, March 7th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. The World Economic Forum believes there has been some progress in narrowing gender gaps, but at the current pace, full gender equality will be reached in the year 2158. Now, that's 133 years from now. Well, against that backdrop, we revisit the issues surrounding gender parity, or disparity, if you will, here in South Korea. For more on this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post in the studio. Kelly, welcome back.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with the Pundit's Take. Colin, it's great to have you here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Kelly, we'll start with you. Let's begin with South Korea's standing with regard to gender equality as compared to its global and regional counterparts.
Yeah, so the World Economic Forum puts out this gender equality index. If you try to download it, I mean, it's extremely long. It's looking at so many factors, and it's quite a comprehensive breakdown of different ways that you can kind of look at gender equality around the world. It measures 146 nations, and South Korea, in its latest report, ranks at about 94. That's actually quite surprising. I think South Korea ranks behind Honduras, the United Arab Emirates, for instance, certainly the United States, which ranked at 43. But, you know, these things look at things in a very scientific, measurable way that maybe doesn't play out in our anecdotal, qualitative way of looking at life. But the way that they attempt to show gender inequality or equality is by looking at four main areas. It's economic participation, the level of educational attainment, health and survival, as well as political involvement. For South Korea in particular, one interesting thing is economic participation was the worst category for South Korea compared to other countries. And as someone who's been a reporter here for 8 years, I think that really speaks to a chronic issue that I hear from Korean people as well as see in the media again and again, which is women often are expected to kind of end their careers. Once they become mothers, they get pushed out of the workforce. Or if they manage to have one child and take maternity leave and they want to grow their family, they feel like they can't have a second one often because they think that that will be the end of their career, that the workplace or the company that they're at will see them as a less valuable asset compared to men or may not welcome them back. And we also see, you know, there's been kind of a culture war happening in South Korea between the genders in the past few years. We certainly saw it play itself out in the last election cycle, where issues of abolishing the gender ministry was a big part of President Yoon's campaign. And so you'll see that South Korean women are actually linking up with men romantically less and less. And this plays itself out in the economic way. And that when people aren't marrying because they perceive marriage to be a compromise to their careers, they're certainly also not starting families. They're not, because they see this as a threat to their economic participation, so to speak.
Right, and staying with economic participation, Colin, the gap in pay depending on gender here in South Korea continues to make headlines. How concerned do you suppose should we be?
I would say our concern should depend on what causes the gap. And thinking about this sends my mind back to World War II, not for the reasons viewers might assume, but during World War II in the Pacific Islands, on islands that were occupied by the U.S. military, there were these islanders, these tribes of islanders who witnessed what was going on with the military there, that they would build airstrips, build air traffic control towers, and then they would perform these operations, these rituals it looked like, and suddenly these giant birds would come down. We know them as airplanes. The birds would come and drop food and clothing and all kinds of fruits of modernity. When the war ended and the U.S. Army left, the military left, the islanders were still there, of course, and they were thinking, well, how do we get that good stuff again? How do we get the food and the clothing and all that stuff? Well, why don't we cut our own runway out of the jungle? Why don't we build our own control towers out of wood? Why don't we have air traffic controllers wearing sort of coconut headphones? They built replicas of all this equipment in hopes that the gods would then return the giant their metal emissaries to drop food and whatnot. This is the cargo cult, the idea of the cargo cult. It's an old anthropological idea. And the cargo cult essentially means, what is cargo cult thinking? It is where you imitate the forms you see before you without an understanding of the mechanics behind what's happening. And when Korea, or official Korea, as I like to say, interprets its OECD statistics especially, something of the cargo cult always comes back to my mind, because with a stat like adult literacy, we have an unambiguous good. And if you are lacking in that stat, something's gone wrong if adults can't read. With the pay gap, the stat itself is not enough to tell you anything. You need to know why it is. There could be bad reasons for it. There could be women getting offered less money for the same work. It could be women not being promoted. These are undesirable reasons and should be corrected if they're found. But there's also the factor that women and men do go into different kinds of work. Careers can take different shapes, as well as Kelly pointed out. Sometimes women are expected to end their careers early, so whether they're being forced to, whether they're doing it voluntarily, that's another issue to tease out. But I think of airlines, for example. When you fly a major Korean airline, one of them, you'll notice, compared to US airlines, the flight attendants are quite young. The average age is much lower. And because it's not considered to be a career, per se, you're expected to work as a flight attendant, as a woman, until you get married, or definitely only until you have a family. At that point, you've got to sort of move along. Whereas in the US, it can be a career. A friend of mine, a childhood friend, American, of course, his mom, he was raised by a single mom. His mom was a flight attendant. She worked for an American airline for 36 years as a flight attendant. So she got a career out of it. She got paychecks the whole time, of course. She retired, but she hated it. And it drove her to drink. I mean, doing that job that long was not, she didn't like it. It was harmful to some degree. So was that the best life outcome for her? I'm not sure, but it does show you a difference between these societies and how sort of women's careers are regarded, for better or for worse.
Right. And also moving forward, Kelly, there are some observers who believe that the gender gap, it's also to blame for the rise in female suicides as well as digital sex crimes targeting women. How do you respond to this?
Yeah, well, suicide in particular is a very tricky topic. I feel South Korea is known to have the highest, sometimes the second highest, suicide rate in the OECD. And this is a chronic issue that I think is multi-pronged. So although gender inequities might be a part of it, I can't say that that is the driving cause. Certainly, I think South Korea, like many other patriarchal societies around the world, has a problem with misogyny, with women being second-class citizens in some respect to, getting paid less, domestic violence and sexual violence not being taken seriously as a very important public health issue. So in relation to the suicide epidemic, I mean, I'm sure that there is some kind of correlation there. We do see, on the topic of digital sex crimes specifically, this is something that South Korea is recurrently in the news for over the last decade or so. We've seen in the last couple of years the controversy over Nbongbang, or the Nth Room, which was kind of the series of Telegram app chat rooms that were circulating often non-consensual, sexually explicit images of women or even female minors. We saw recent controversies with deepfakes, and there were individual cases where there were suicides reported related to women having their likeness used on sexually explicit material using AI technology, which is a fairly new front of how we're seeing this problem. And then I remember when I first came to Korea as a correspondent, the word of the time was molka, right? Mole cameras. I'd never even heard of a mole camera outside of like a KGB spy movie context before then, but these are very tiny cameras. They look like a little dot. They were repeatedly being found in hotel rooms, bathrooms, and I remember it was kind of almost a public relations campaign in the city of Seoul that they had women in vests going out and using metal detectors and looking for these, or stickers in women's public bathroom stalls saying, don't worry, here's the time that this was last checked, and there would be like a little, timestamp update, and people would stuff toilet paper into like little holes that they would see in doors or in the stucco of walls. So I mean, this is kind of a chronic issue. What we're seeing is that technology is evolving, and so the way that this is playing itself out evolves. And in general, I mean, studies show that women who are threatened with non-consensual sexual material of themselves, or women who sexual images of themselves are non-consensually released in public, there is a correlation there between that and suicidal ideation or behaviors. But I mean, I don't think you necessarily need research to back that up. I mean, sexual crimes in general are probably among some of the worst things that you can do to men or women, period. And so, you know, South Korea, this continually makes international headlines here. It's an issue in the US and everywhere else as well. I think with Korea, you see kind of this highly wired, highly technologically forward society, and then when that meets misogyny or violence against women, it creates a very ugly picture.
Right. Unfortunately, of course. But it's also a universal problem, as you mentioned. Colin, following the brief imposition of martial law last December, quite a number of foreign media outlets shed light on the tangible presence of female protesters out on the streets, rallying against, of course, the imposition of martial law. How do you care to explain this phenomenon?
Right, it was certainly an angle taken by foreign media, in part because Yoon was by then long regarded as being anti-woman, so said by his detractors, and different detractors substantiate that differently. One reason that's often pointed to is his campaign promise of scrapping the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, I believe they call it in English. And his supporters would say, well, that's because it wasn't doing its job. It wasn't creating inequality. His detractors would, of course, say that's just an excuse. He wants to abolish it to abolish gender equality itself. And I could see arguments being made either way, although I should note that the one person I know who worked on Yoon's campaign is in fact a woman and highly educated both in Korea and the US, and she was of the mind that the argument was correct, that this ministry was not doing anything to further gender equality. And so the idea, at least as far as it goes, that getting rid of it was a step to replacing it with something that could work, she accepted that. Now, what she thinks of his current performance, I'm not sure, but I had no choice really but to accept her perspective on that one. And in any case, I think in politics, especially when it's politics viewed from the lens of another country's media, a politician or a political player gets one image and they're stuck with it. And so I don't think Yoon could do anything to be regarded as anything other than anti-woman, anti-equality. He's often described as an extreme right-winger by foreign media as well, and we can get to the relationship between gender and sort of left and right on the spectrum later. But I think, you know, once you're tagged rightly or wrongly, it's very hard to shake that image.
Right, and staying with leaders, but going beyond borders, Kelly, following Trump's election victory in late last year, there was a bit of US media coverage about a fringe movement here in South Korea that was gathering quite a bit of a following in the US as well. I believe you covered a related story also. Could you tell us a bit more about the 4B movement, so to speak?
Yeah, so the 4B movement is kind of this online native digital grassroots movement that I think is fair to say is more of a fringe form of online feminism in South Korea. And it started around the 2010s and has gotten attention recently because Americans have kind of discovered it, resonated with it, and forwarded it as an idea on TikTok and other social media platforms. So when Trump was reelected this past November, a lot of young women felt like this was a referendum, so to speak, on women's sexual reproductive rights, as well as women's rights in general, because we know that Trump, for instance, is against Roe v. Wade and, you know, a lot of other women's issues at this time. And so this kind of movement has been kind of co-opted in the American context, but at its core, it's this idea that the 4Bs, this is a little complicated. So in Korean, the B is meant to represent no, basically. And so, for instance, the word in Korean for marriage is 결혼. So they'll say 피혼, like against marriage. And so the 4Bs are no marriage, no dating, no reproducing with men, and I think the other one is no sex. I have actually never met a woman who identifies as part of the 4B movement. I've met South Korean women who identify as pihon, or against marriage. So maybe they're okay with dating or sexual relations with a man, but they believe that marriage is fundamentally against them, that it's something that they don't want to live out, that it doesn't advantage them in any way. And so, you know, I can't give numbers on how many women actually follow this. I think naturally what we're seeing in South Korea is that women and men are separating and getting married less and less, because women see marriage as another set of responsibilities that they have to take on while still working. And in general, loneliness is sort of an epidemic in this country and among younger people, probably around the world in general. So I mentioned that this really cropped up in the 2010s. There are certain things that have kind of stoked this movement, as well as the feminist movement in South Korea in general. In 2016, there was that really terrible murder of a 23-year-old woman in Gangnam Station, and the older male assailant murdered her at random and had said something to the effect of he was tired of being rejected by women. At this time, this really fueled a lot of mass protests against violence against women and just kind of women's lesser place in society. We saw this again 2 years later when the Me Too movement in the US kind of spilled over into South Korea. We saw a lot of women coming out and talking about things that had been happening to them. And again, we saw this mass mobilization of young women in particular, but women in general in South Korea speaking out, speaking up for their rights. And, you know, 4B is kind of an offshoot of this in a way where I think some people would say it's extreme, but the response is to basically swear off of men altogether.
Right, and beyond the 4B movement here in Korea, Colin, in recent years, there has been quite a bit of coverage about the growing ideological divide between men and women in general. How severe is this reality, and what do you believe are the reasons behind it?
Well, in a way, I'm surprised that men and women were more politically on the same page before. I'm surprised how much they seemed to agree before. Just today, I scrolled by this scientific paper somebody was posting about how in the US, this was an experiment done in the US that seemed to show that supplementary testosterone use made Democratic voters more likely to vote Republican. It made them vote more right-wing, the more testosterone they were using. So that's an interesting result. It brought to mind a conversation I had here with a longtime foreign Korea observer, been here more than 40 years. We were talking about Trump and all that, and he was saying his theory was that in the US and other countries, the left-wing party tends to be the sort of mother party, and the right-wing party, the father party. They bring different types of authority to bear, different sort of worldviews to bear. And you have too long of one, eventually people get sick of it and they want the other. We've had mom too long in the power seat, we're going to have dad there. And then you get sick of dad, you want mom back. And so I think there is a basic divide here between men and women that is going to get expressed politically, that naturally gets expressed politically, for instance, the more women participate in politics. And so I think this is something we may have to just accommodate ourselves to, that men and women vote differently, and we're going to get political parties or centers of power that play to that. That know how to appeal to each side. And different countries have handled this differently, but you can see, I think in Korea, the more women participate in politics, the more of an apparent divide, the more deep the divide seems to be, although maybe that's just revealing disagreements that already existed that hadn't been expressed before, hadn't been allowed to be expressed, or there wasn't the political pathways to express it before.
Right. Kelly, as you mentioned earlier, there are pundits who believe that the low birth rate here in South Korea can be linked to the severe gender gap. Do you suppose better addressing this particular gap, perhaps better offering women an opportunity to work as well as raise a family, would perhaps better address the low birth rate in the country?
Certainly, I think the proof is in the pudding that a lot of women are not having children because there is an economic need for both people in a family, the man and the woman in a nuclear heterosexual family, to work these days. The cost of living is very high. And if one person sees having a child as the end or a major disruption to their career, I mean, they're probably not going to do it. or they're certainly not going to have more than one child if they can even manage that sacrifice. There's been plenty of research about this. I think, that is a clear issue that's happening here. The other thing is that, I think this is common knowledge at this point. South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. We celebrated last week the fact that it went up slightly in the last year or so, but that might have just been because of post-pandemic marriages. South Korea's birth rate is about 0.75, so imagine it's 3/4 of a baby per woman. To compare, the U.S., it's 1.66, and the U.S. is also worried about its birth rate lately. And one of the things beyond just career disruptions that we discussed in recent weeks was, for instance, there's this economist, Claudia Goodwin, and she did some interesting research basically suggesting that there's a clear correlation between the amount of extra work a woman does in the home over her husband and there being a low birth rate. So if you look at a country like France, there's a lot more parity in the amount of work that men and women are sharing in the home, and they have a pretty decent birth rate. In South Korea, there's a big disparity between the amount of work that women and men on average are doing in the home, and the birth rate's incredibly low. And that phenomenon is also observable in Italy, Portugal, and many other countries. So I do think that the birth rate and gender inequality, there's no doubt that there's a relationship there. Unfortunately, some of these solutions are quite difficult because it's not just about government policy, it's also about shifting the culture in the workplace, in the home, in terms of patriarchy, in the family. We need to make marriage and child rearing more appealing to women for them to want to do it at this point. That's clear.
Right. It seems like we need to have a more comprehensive framework to deal with the low birth rate then. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Kelly, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
And Colin, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Have a good weekend.